My older sister stood at the head of my own dining table and informed me that I no longer had a seat in the family. She didn't know I had been waiting for her to say it. It was Christmas Eve. The table was one I had painstakingly set, adorned with silver candelabras and a centerpiece of winter pine. The roasted duck I had prepared over 2 days sat perfectly glazed in the center. The vintage wine was breathing in its decanter. She pushed back her velvet chair, looked at every face around the table, her husband Garrett, our parents, our younger brother Julian, and delivered her verdict with a terrifying, rehearsed certainty. "We held a family vote," my sister Chloe said, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "You are no longer a part of this family. We want you to step away from the estate, from the family trust, and from us." The antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room ticked. Nobody moved. My mother looked down at her plate. My father adjusted his collar. Garrett, my charismatic brother-in-law, watched me with a predatory, expectant stillness. I was not surprised. In fact, I had known about their little conspiracy for exactly 3 weeks. I didn't cry, I didn't scream or demand an explanation. I calmly reached for the thick manila folder resting beside my wineglass, bound tightly with a deep red silk ribbon. "Before I leave," I said, my voice as calm and unbothered as a frozen lake, "open this. Consider it a parting gift." She opened the folder, she read the first page, her eyes scanning the bold, federal print, and then the silence of the room was shattered. She began to scream, "Welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into a story about a woman whose family attempts to exile her to seize her inheritance, only to discover she has brought a dossier that will absolutely obliterate their reality." Drop a comment below, let me know where you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. My name is Sloan, I am 32 years old, and I do not work in a warm, nurturing profession. I am the Senior Director of Crisis Public Relations for one of the most ruthless corporate strategy firms in Manhattan. When a Fortune 500 CEO is caught embezzling funds, or a tech billionaire is facing a catastrophic public scandal, I am the person they call at 3 in the morning. My job is to diagnose the disaster, map the fault lines, and control the narrative before the media can tear my clients apart. I am an expert at reading the micro-expressions of people who are lying to save their own lives. I analyze body language, financial anomalies, and the invisible architecture of betrayal. I am very good at what I do. My colleagues call me the Ice Queen, my clients call me a lifesaver. Because of my profession, I rarely raise my voice. In a crisis, panic is a weapon used against you. Composure is your shield. I spent my entire adult life mapping the fault lines of other people's disasters. I never thought to check for the one running straight through the center of my own family. That failure was mine, and I own it completely. I was so practiced at reading the lies of panicked billionaires that I forgot to scrutinize the people who sat across from me every Sunday for brunch. The crisis director, who could spot a corporate coup from a single email thread, could not see the conspiracy forming in her own childhood home. This is the story of how I uncovered their plot, and exactly what I did when I found out. The estate where this all went down was a massive, historic stone manor in the Hudson Valley. It was bequeathed to me by my late grandfather, a man who saw past my family's superficiality and recognized my quiet, steadfast competence. My parents, Richard and Eleanor, were socialites who treated money like an endless natural resource. They were charming, frivolous, and deeply resentful that the estate had bypassed them and gone straight to the daughter they considered too cold and unfeminine. My sister Chloe was 36 and the golden child. She was radiant, emotional, and chronically incapable of making a sensible decision. She treated life like a movie where she was the undisputed star, and everyone else existed merely to provide supporting dialogue. And then, there was Garrett. Chloe married Garrett 5 years ago. He was a wealth management consultant, a title that sounded incredibly prestigious, but upon closer inspection, meant absolutely nothing. He was handsome in a calculated, aggressive way. He wore bespoke suits, laughed at the exact right moments, and possessed an uncanny ability to make whoever he was speaking to feel like the most important person in the room. I noticed his technique the very first time he attended a family dinner. He calculated the room the way an apex predator surveys a watering hole. His eyes moved a fraction of a second before his smile did, constantly scanning for leverage. He mirrored my father's posture, he flattered my mother's vanity, he played the role of the devoted, brilliant son-in-law to absolute perfection. Chloe fell in love with the performance. I couldn't entirely blame her. The performance was flawless. But when they announced their engagement, something fired in the part of my brain that my career had sharpened into a lethal instrument. I had sat across conference tables from 100 men exactly like Garrett. Men who viewed relationships as transactions, men whose charm was their primary currency, and whose exit strategies were always drafted, long before the ink dried on the contract. In my line of work, you learn a fundamental truth. The most dangerous people in the world are not the ones who throw tantrums or shout. The most dangerous people are the ones who go completely cold for a fraction of a second when they are denied something, and then immediately flash a warm, accommodating smile. I saw Garrett go cold exactly once. It was shortly after the engagement when I quietly suggested to Chloe, in my capacities as a professional who deals with asset protection, that she should request an ironclad prenuptial agreement. She was inheriting a substantial trust fund, and it was standard procedure. Garrett wasn't supposed to hear the conversation, but he walked into the kitchen just as the words left my mouth. For a single terrifying heartbeat, his face went completely blank. The charm evaporated, leaving behind a look of pure, calculating malice. Then the smile returned, bright and synthetic. "Of course, Sloane," he had said, his voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Whatever makes Chloe feel secure, I completely understand." He didn't argue, he didn't protest. He simply filed the interaction away and began a slow, invisible 18-month campaign to systematically erase me from the family. In my boardroom, when a hostile corporate takeover is initiated, it rarely begins with a massive, public declaration of war. It starts with whispers, it starts with the subtle realignment of loyalties, the quiet discrediting of key executives, and the slow manipulation of the board of directors. Garrett executed a textbook hostile takeover of my family, and he did it with a masterclass level of psychological precision. I was not there when he reframed my advice about the prenuptial agreement, but I didn't need to be. I saw the immediate aftermath. Chloe's attitude toward me shifted overnight. The sister who used to call me to complain about her manicurist or ask for fashion advice suddenly became distant and defensive. She confronted me a week later, her voice sharp and rehearsed. "If you actually trusted my judgment, Sloane, you wouldn't be trying to force Garrett into signing a legal document." She had snapped, standing in the foyer of my estate. "You're treating the man I love like a gold digger before we're even married. It's exactly why you're still single. You view everyone as a liability." I didn't argue. Choosing which hill to die on is the first rule of crisis management. And trying to convince a woman in the throes of a delusional romance that her fiancé is a predator is a battle you will lose 100% of the time. I let the prenup issue go, but Garrett did not let it go. He recognized that my analytical nature was a threat to whatever long-term grift he was planning. So he began a slow, invisible campaign to completely discredit me. It happened drip by drip. After every family gathering, there was a quiet word in the car ride home. "Did you notice how Sloane was analyzing everyone during dinner? It's like she's always waiting for us to make a mistake." After every phone call between Chloe and me, he would plant a seed of doubt. "She sounded so cold today. Do you think she resents how happy we are?" He didn't just target Chloe, he systematically isolated me from my parents as well. My parents were financially secure, but their lifestyle was exorbitant, and they constantly felt the sting of my grandfather's decision to leave the sprawling Hudson Valley estate and its accompanying maintenance trust to me. Garrett expertly weaponized that resentment. During Sunday brunches, when I was in the restroom or taking a client call, he would lean across the table and sigh sympathetically. "It's such a shame that a beautiful, historic property like the manor is just sitting there, occupied by one person who works all the time. It really should be the vibrant center of the family. It's almost selfish of her to hoard it." My mother, who had always viewed the estate as her rightful stage for hosting lavish galas, absorbed his poison like a sponge. The comments started shortly after, remarks about how I was wasting the property, how my career was making me hard and unapproachable, how I should really consider legally transferring the deed to the family trust up, so that everyone could enjoy it. The final piece of his coalition was my younger brother Julian. Julian was 26, charming, entirely aimless, and burdened by a mountain of credit card debt from his failed attempts to launch various lifestyle brands. I loved Julian, but I refused to finance his irresponsibility. I had offered to pay for his MBA, or to hire him in an entry-level position at my firm so he could learn discipline. He declined, preferring the illusion of success to the reality of hard work. Garrett recognized Julian's vulnerability immediately. To a manipulator, a desperate ego is an open door. Garrett began inviting Julian to exclusive networking events and high-end cocktail hours. He dangled the promise of lucrative venture capital connections, whispering about angel investors who were just waiting to fund Julian's next big idea. Once we sort out the situation with the estate, I overheard Garrett telling Julian during a 4th of July barbecue, "I'll introduce you to the partners at my firm. We need visionary thinkers like you, not people who are stuck in the mud, obsessing over rules and regulations." The validation I refused to offer, because I believed in earning it, Garrett handed out for free. It cost him absolutely nothing, and it bought him my brother's unwavering loyalty. Julian didn't hate me, but he hated the fact that I held him to a standard he was too lazy to reach. Garrett gave him permission to stop trying, and in Julian's mind, that permission felt like profound kindness. Over the next 2 years, the coalition solidified. Chloe, fueled by manufactured grievances; my parents, fueled by aristocratic greed; Julian, fueled by the promise of unearned wealth. Garrett had built a united front, and he hadn't even needed to raise his voice to do it. The physical isolation began in the autumn of last year. It didn't happen with a massive blowout argument. They simply started editing me out of the narrative. The weekly Sunday dinners, a tradition we had maintained for a decade, were suddenly rescheduled without my knowledge. I would call my mother on a Sunday afternoon, only to hear the clinkings of silverware and Garrett's booming laugh in the background. "Oh, Sloan, darling," my mother would say, her voice tight with artificial sweetness. "It was a last-minute thing. We knew you were so terribly busy with one of your corporate disasters. We didn't want to bother you." In October, Julian moved into a luxury loft in Brooklyn. I didn't find out from him. I saw the photos on Chloe's Instagram account. A sprawling housewarming party, complete with a catered sushi bar, and a DJ. Garrett was in the center of the frame, his arms slung around Julian's shoulders, holding a glass of champagne. I wasn't even invited. The following month, Chloe posted a series of professional family portraits taken at a country club. My parents, Chloe, Garrett, and Julian, all wearing coordinated autumnal colors, smiling radiantly against a backdrop of turning leaves. The caption read, "My entire world in one photo. Family is everything." Every photo was a portrait of a family. And every photo was missing the same person. I could have confronted them. I could have driven to my parents' penthouse, kicked the door open, and demanded an explanation. I could have sent a blistering group text outlining exactly how childish and transparent they were being. I could have cried. I didn't do any of those things. In crisis management, when the opposition begins a coordinated smear campaign, reacting emotionally is exactly what they want you to do. If I had thrown a tantrum, I would have simply validated the narrative Garrett had meticulously crafted. That I was an unstable, controlling, jealous woman who couldn't handle their happiness. They wanted me to act crazy so they could justify cutting me out. I refused to give them the satisfaction. Instead, I did what my career had trained me to do. I stepped back, I observed the data, I cataloged the behaviors. Decades of analyzing corporate fraud had taught me a very specific lesson. When an entire board of directors suddenly aligns against a single executive, without a clear, precipitating event, it is never about interpersonal conflict. It is always, without exception, about money. Garrett wasn't isolating me because he found my personality grating. He was isolating me because I was the sole proprietor of a historic estate, appraised at nearly $10 million, and I was the only person in the family who was immune to his manipulation. I was an obstacle in a financial equation, and I was about to find out exactly how he planned to solve it. I didn't need to hire a private investigator. When you spend your days dismantling the alibis of white-collar criminals, tracing hidden assets is essentially muscle memory. I didn't hack emails or tap phones. I didn't need to do anything that would compromise my own legal standing. The beautiful thing about financial fraud is that it almost always leaves a paper trail in the public domain, provided you know exactly which stones to turn over. I started with the basics. I ran a comprehensive background check on Garrett's wealth management firm through the state's corporate registry. It took me less than 3 hours to discover that Ascension Capital Partners, the prestigious-sounding firm he supposedly ran, was little more than a polished website and a rented mailbox in a high-end commercial district. He had exactly 3 active clients, and according to the quarterly tax filings I pulled, the firm was operating at a net loss. Garrett wasn't a financial wizard, he was a parasite, and the host he had attached himself to was my sister. The realization didn't shock me, it merely confirmed my initial hypothesis. The real question was not whether he was a fraud, but the specific mechanics of his exit strategy. A man like Garrett doesn't spend 5 years cultivating a wealthy family just to live comfortably in their shadow. He was building up to a massive liquidation event. The missing puzzle piece arrived entirely by accident in early November. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my office, reviewing a press release for a pharmaceutical client, when my phone buzzed. It was a group text from Julian, which was highly unusual, since I had been effectively blacklisted from his digital life. He had clearly selected the wrong contact group in a moment of carelessness. The message was a forwarded text from Garrett. It read, "Julian, just hold tight. Once we finalize the structural changes with your sister at Christmas, the liquidity will open up. I'll get you that seed capital for your brand by January 1st. Just make sure the parents stay on script for the vote." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The air in my office suddenly felt very thin. Structural changes, the vote January 1st. I read the text 3 times, dissecting the language with the precision of a prosecutor examining a confession. He had given them a script. He had organized a coordinated vote to forcibly remove me from the estate, dangling the promise of liquid capital to buy Julian's compliance. I didn't reply to the text. I took a screenshot, backed it up to a secure encrypted server, and deleted the message from my phone. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of my office, looking down at the Manhattan traffic. The entire operation crystallized in my mind. Garrett was employing a classic corporate squeeze-out maneuver, adapted for a family dynamic. Step 1. Isolate the target. Remove me from the emotional fabric of the family, so that my eventual expulsion would feel like a natural progression rather than a hostile act. Step 2. Orchestrate the vote, by framing my removal as a democratic, collective family decision. Garrett shielded himself from direct blame. It wasn't him kicking me out, it was the family, making a difficult but necessary choice for the collective good. Step 3. The extortion. Once I was emotionally devastated and socially isolated, facing the combined rejection of my parents and siblings, Garrett would present the solution. He would offer me a chance to buy back my family's affection by legally transferring the deed of the Hudson Valley estate into the family trust, a trust that my parents controlled, but which Garrett, as the resident wealth manager, undoubtedly had functional access to. It was a brilliant, vicious plan. It relied entirely on the assumption that my desire for my family's love was stronger than my instinct for self-preservation. He was betting that the Ice Queen would melt when faced with total abandonment. He had miscalculated catastrophically. Knowing the plan wasn't enough, I needed to know why the timeline was so aggressive. Why Christmas? Why the sudden rush for January 1st liquidity? A man running a long con doesn't suddenly accelerate the timeline unless he is running out of runway. I needed to see Chloe's personal financial architecture. Because Chloe was technically a beneficiary of a secondary trust, that my firm had briefly consulted on years ago. I knew the name of the primary wealth manager who handled her liquid assets, a woman named Evelyn Hayes, who operated out of a boutique firm in Connecticut. I didn't break any laws, I didn't hack into Evelyn's mainframe, I simply utilized a professional contact. I called a colleague who owed me a massive favor from a previous crisis intervention, someone who had legitimate legal access to international banking registries. I need you to run a discreet inquiry on an individual named Garrett Mercer, I told him over an encrypted line. Cross-reference his name with any recent offshore wire transfers originating from domestic accounts tied to Chloe Mercer. Look for high-volume movement in the last 90 days. It took 2 days to get the results. When the encrypted file landed in my inbox, I locked my office door and opened it. I had expected to find embezzlement. I had expected to find a few $100,000 siphoned off to cover Garrett's failing business expenses, or perhaps a secret gambling debt. What I found was financial butchery. Over the past 4 months, Garrett had systematically liquidated every single joint asset he shared with my sister. He had drawn down the massive equity line on their Manhattan penthouse to the absolute maximum. He had cashed out Chloe's secondary trust fund, exploiting a loophole in her marriage contract that allowed him to act as a financial proxy. He had even altered the beneficiary status on a massive life insurance policy, changing the recipient from Chloe to an LLC registered in Delaware under his own name. The total sum of the liquidated assets was staggering. $2.5 million, but the money hadn't stayed in domestic accounts. The registry report showed a series of massive wire transfers, executed in increments perfectly designed to avoid immediate federal flagging, moving the entire $2.5 million into a numbered corporate account in the Cayman Islands. I sat at my desk, the glow of the monitor illuminating my face in the darkened office. The puzzle was complete. Garrett wasn't just planning to steal my estate, he was planning to steal my estate on his way out the door. The vote at Christmas wasn't about bringing the family together, it was a distraction. It was a massive emotional smokescreen designed to keep everyone entirely focused on destroying me, so that nobody would notice the financial ground collapsing beneath their own feet. He was going to convince them to force me to hand over the deed to the Hudson Valley Manor. He would likely leverage that deed for a massive immediate loan. And then, with the estate's equity added to his Cayman Islands account, he would vanish. By the time Chloe realized her bank accounts were empty, Garrett would be a ghost on a beach in a non-extradition country. I didn't feel a surge of panic, I didn't feel the urge to call Chloe and warn her. She had spent the last 2 years actively participating in my emotional assassination. She had called me cold, she had called me a liability, she had blindly handed her entire life over to a man who viewed her as nothing more than an ATM with a pulse. If I warned her now, without undeniable physical proof, in a setting where Garrett couldn't talk his way out of it, she wouldn't believe me. She would run straight to him, tell him I was trying to sabotage their marriage out of jealousy, and he would accelerate his exit timeline, leaving her destitute. No, if a tumor is malignant, you don't treat it with a gentle conversation. You treat it with a scalpel, in bright light, where everyone can see exactly what is being cut out. I opened a new secure document on my computer. I began compiling the evidence, the wire transfer receipts, the offshore account routing numbers, the equity line drawdown statements. I organized them chronologically, highlighting the most damning figures in fluorescent yellow. I was going to give them their family vote, and then, I was going to give them the absolute, unvarnished truth. The financial data was a devastating weapon, but in the realm of crisis management, data alone is often insufficient to break a deep-seated emotional delusion. People like my sister, who have tethered their entire identity to a fabricated reality, will perform Olympic-level mental gymnastics to explain away a wire transfer. Garrett would simply claim the offshore accounts were part of a complex international investment strategy designed to maximize their wealth, and Chloe would eagerly swallow the lie because the alternative was admitting she had married a monster. I needed something visceral, something that Garrett couldn't contextualize or explain away with a charming smile and a patronizing tone. I needed the legal equivalent of a kill shot. If a man is liquidating $2.5 million and moving it to a non-extradition jurisdiction, he is not planning to return. But Garrett was meticulous. He wouldn't just vanish and leave himself exposed to a messy, international spousal support lawsuit. He would want to legally sever the tie before the financial bomb detonated. I turned my attention from international banking registries to domestic family court filings. Because I had extensive experience dealing with high-profile executives trying to bury their indiscretions, I knew exactly how they manipulated the system to keep legal filings quiet. You don't file for a divorce in the county where you live. The local gossip columns would pick it up instantly. You file in a remote, neighboring county where nobody knows your name, and you orchestrate the service of process so that you personally intercept the summons before your spouse ever sees it. I spent 4 hours running variations of Garrett and Chloe's names through the public electronic dockets of every county court within a 200-mile radius. At 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, the search algorithm finally returned a hit. It was filed in a small, obscure county court in upstate New York, 3 hours away from their Manhattan penthouse. Garrett Mercer v. Chloe Mercer, case number 2024 DR 08832, filed on October 15, exactly 1 week after Julian's housewarming party. Exactly the time frame when the family's physical isolation of me became absolute. He had removed me from the board first, and then he had immediately filed the paperwork to dissolve his marriage. Because I was the only person in the family who knew how to read the warning signs. A crisis PR director is an incredibly inconvenient audience when you are staging a covert financial exit. I paid the required municipal fees and downloaded the certified PDF of the divorce petition. I read it with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining an X-ray. The language was standard irreconcilable differences, but the asset schedule attached to the filing was a masterclass in perjury. It listed joint bank accounts that I knew for a fact he had already drained. It listed the life insurance policy that he had already transferred to his own LLC. It was a document designed to secure a quick, uncontested default judgment, relying entirely on the fact that Chloe had no idea the proceedings even existed. I sat back in my leather office chair, staring at the ceiling. The sheer scale of the betrayal was almost breathtaking. I had read hundreds of hostile corporate filings in my career. Not one had my own sister's name on it as the target. I printed the divorce petition. I laid it on my mahogany desk next to the offshore wire transfer receipts and the drawdown statements from the equity line. Then I went one step further. I utilized a contact at a major international airline, a former client whose reputation I had saved during a catastrophic PR nightmare, to run a discreet check on a passenger manifest. An hour later, the final piece of evidence arrived. A confirmed first-class one-way ticket to Georgetown, Cayman Islands. Passenger, Garrett Mercer, departure date, December 26th. 2 days after Christmas, 2 days after the family vote, where he planned to bully me into handing over the Hudson Valley estate. He was going to use my childhood home as his final payday, and then he was going to disappear into the Caribbean sun, leaving my family entirely bankrupt and legally entangled. I gathered the documents. The divorce petition went on top, the wire transfers beneath it, the one-way flight itinerary at the bottom. I placed them all into a thick, heavy manila folder. From a drawer in my desk, I retrieved a spool of deep red silk ribbon, the kind my grandfather used to tie around holiday gifts, because he believed presentation was a form of respect. I tied the ribbon around the folder tightly. It looked festive, it looked innocuous. It was 40 pages of concentrated annihilation. The 3 weeks leading up to Christmas Eve were a study in psychological endurance. I maintained my regular routines. I managed a media fallout for a tech CEO. I navigated a delicate merger announcement. But beneath the surface, my mind was operating like a supercomputer, simulating the impending confrontation. Julian texted me a week before Christmas. The message had the stilted, awkward cadence of someone reading from a script. Sloan, We're all coming to the manor for Christmas Eve dinner. It's important that you're there. We need to have a serious family discussion. Important. The coached witness, the target must be present for the ambush. I wouldn't miss it, Julian. I replied. The day of Christmas Eve arrived with a bitter, biting cold that felt appropriate. The Hudson Valley Manor was draped in snow, looking like a postcard from a bygone era. I spent the entire day preparing the dinner. I roasted the duck, I prepared the winter vegetables, I polished the antique silver. I did it not out of love for the people who were coming to destroy me, but because the contrast was necessary. When you deliver a fatal blow, the setting must be immaculate. The juxtaposition of a perfect holiday table and the brutal reality of their betrayal would amplify the impact exponentially. At 5 p.m., I went upstairs to my grandfather's old master suite to dress for the execution. I did not wear the sensible, understated clothing I usually favored when dealing with my family. Tonight I was not the disappointing, overly serious sister. I was the senior director of crisis management and I was about to go to war. I selected a tailored emerald green silk dress that draped perfectly. It was elegant, severe, and possessed an architectural sharpness that commanded immediate respect. It was the sartorial equivalent of a drawn weapon. I paired it with simple stiletto heels and swept my hair back into a flawless, unyielding twist. I applied a deep red lipstick. When I looked in the antique mirror, the woman staring back did not look like a victim. She looked like a judge about to deliver a sentence. I walked downstairs, the stiletto heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floors. The house was filled with the smell of roasted duck and pine. The table was set for 6. I placed the manila folder on the chair beside my seat, partially obscured by a linen napkin. At exactly 6 p.m., the headlights of Garrett's leased Mercedes SUV swept across the snow-covered driveway. The ambush had arrived. I poured myself a single glass of vintage red wine, took a measured sip, and waited for the door to open. My parents were the first to walk through the heavy oak doors of the manor. My mother, Eleanor, was wearing a sweeping cashmere coat and an expression of polite endurance, the kind a monarch might wear while visiting a slightly impoverished colony. My father, Richard, trailed behind her, already checking his phone, emotionally disconnected before he had even taken off his scarf. They offered brief, performative hugs that involved minimal physical contact and a quick kiss directed at the air next to my cheek. Julian arrived next. He practically vibrated with nervous energy, smelling heavily of expensive cologne and anxiety. He hugged me a fraction of a second too long, the way a man holds on to someone when he is carrying a massive, unarticulated guilt. "Hey, Sloane," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. He was 26, but in that moment, he looked like a child who had just broken a window and was waiting for the punishment to fall. Then, Chloe and Garrett. Chloe swept into the foyer wearing a glittering, inappropriately formal silver dress. Her hair was styled perfectly, but her eyes were frantic, darting around the expansive entryway, as if looking for the cameras. She gave me a stiff, abbreviated embrace. "Sloane, the house looks exactly the same." She noted, her tone a masterclass in passive aggression. Garrett didn't hug me. He offered a firm, professional handshake, his grip just slightly too tight, establishing dominance. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, looking every inch the successful wealth manager he was pretending to be. His eyes swept over my emerald silk dress, lingering for a fraction of a second on the severe, architectural lines. He didn't say anything, but I saw the micro-expression. A flicker of unease. He had expected the mousy, quiet sister in a drab sweater, the easy target he had been conditioning for 2 years. He had not expected the Ice Queen. "Garrett," I said smoothly, my voice devoid of warmth. "Drink?" "Scotch neat, thanks, Sloane," he replied, flashing his signature blinding smile. We moved into the formal dining room. The ambiance was a surreal juxtaposition of holiday warmth and Arctic tension. The fire crackled in the massive stone hearth, the candles flickered, casting long shadows across the antique wallpaper. The smell of the roasted duck and rosemary filled the air. It looked like a perfect family Christmas, provided you ignored the fact that 5 of the 6 people at the table were actively conspiring to destroy the 6th. The meal commenced with the agonizing, delicate dance of small talk. It is a terrifying thing to watch people you have known your entire life attempt to act normal while harboring a malicious secret. In crisis management, we call this the containment phase, the period where the guilty party tries to maintain the illusion of control while the walls are closing in. My mother complained about the waitlist at their country club. My father discussed a golf trip to Scotland. Julian babbled nervously about a new tech startup he was supposedly consulting for, constantly glancing at Garrett for validation. Garrett steered the conversation with effortless, sociopathic grace, keeping the current moving quickly so that nobody could dwell on any single topic for too long. I ate my duck in perfect silence, I sipped my wine, I watched them, I studied Garrett the way I once studied a corrupt pharmaceutical executive during a deposition. I catalogued the manipulation, I noticed how he subtly touched Chloe's arm whenever she seemed to hesitate. I noticed how he nodded encouragingly at Julian. He was conducting an orchestra, and he believed he had total control over every instrument. Dessert was served, a decadent chocolate tart. The conversation slowed. The wine bottles were mostly empty. The tension in the room began to thicken, heavy and electric. It was the atmospheric pressure that precedes a severe storm. Garrett leaned back in his chair. He placed both hands flat on the table, palms down, fingers splayed. It was a gesture of anchoring, a physical manifestation of taking control of the physical space. Then he delivered the signal. It was almost imperceptible, a tiny downward tilt of his chin directed precisely at Chloe. If you had not spent 10 years analyzing the nonverbal cues of corporate conspirators, you would have missed it entirely. But I didn't miss it. I had seen that exact nod 100 times, the defense attorney signaling the witness, the CEO signaling the CFO your turn. Chloe inhaled sharply, a long measured breath through her nose. Her shoulders stiffened. She placed her linen napkin carefully beside her dessert plate. She pushed her velvet chair back. The wood scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. She stood up. "Sloane," Chloe began, her voice trembling slightly before she forced it into a higher, rehearsed register. She looked around the table, gathering strength from her co-conspirators. Julian was staring intensely at his half-eaten tart. My mother was nodding in small, mechanical intervals. Garrett was watching me with predatory calm, his eyes flat and unblinking. "We need to have a very serious discussion," Chloe continued, her voice gaining momentum. "We, the family, have been talking about this for months. Your behavior, your career, it has made you entirely detached from us. You treat us like clients instead of family. You hoard this massive estate, while the rest of us are out there, actually trying to build something." She paused, swallowing hard. "We held a family vote." The words dropped into the room like heavy stones falling into a deep well. "You are no longer a part of this family." Chloe delivered the verdict, her voice finally breaking on the last word. "We have all agreed, we want you to step away from family events. We want you to legally transfer the deed of the manor into the family trust. It's what grandfather would have wanted if he knew how cold you would become. It's time for you to leave." She finished her speech. She stood there, breathing heavily, flanked by my parents and my brother, fortified by the man who was actively destroying her life. I looked at each of them. I looked at Julian, who couldn't even raise his eyes to meet mine. I looked at my parents, who wore expressions of smug, aristocratic justification. I looked at Garrett, who had a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The architect of my destruction, waiting for the building to collapse. In my profession, the silence following a devastating accusation is where the truth lives. If you panic, you validate the accusation. If you stay silent, you force the accuser to sit in the uncomfortable void of their own aggression. I folded my hands on the antique table. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds. The grandfather clock ticked heavily in the corner. "I know," I said, 2 words quiet, perfectly enunciated, and utterly devoid of emotion. The room froze. The smirk vanished from Garrett's face instantly. My mother stopped her mechanical nodding. Julian finally looked up. "What do you mean, you know?" Chloe asked, the rehearsed confidence shattering, replaced by genuine confusion. I mean, I have known about this pathetic little conspiracy for 3 weeks, I replied, my voice dropping into the icy, unchallengeable tone I used to break hostile witnesses. I have known since Julian accidentally forwarded me a text message from Garrett regarding structural changes and liquidity events scheduled for January 1st. The target must be present for the ambush, correct, Julian? Julian went entirely pale, the color draining from his face as if he were about to be sick. You hacked my phone, Julian stammered. I didn't have to hack anything, Julian. You are simply incompetent, I said, not looking at him. My eyes were locked entirely on Garrett. If you knew we were voting you out, Chloe said, her voice rising in panic, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Why did you even let us come here? Why did you make dinner? I reached beneath the linen napkin beside my plate. My fingers brushed the cool, smooth surface of the thick manila folder. I lifted it and placed it directly in the center of the table, the deep red silk ribbon catching the flickering light of the candelabras. The weight of the 40 pages inside landed with a solid, definitive thud. Because I have something for you, Chloe, I said smoothly, leaning back in my chair and adjusting the cuffs of my emerald silk dress. Consider it a parting gift. Chloe stared at the thick manila folder resting in the center of the mahogany table. Her fingers hovered over the deep red silk ribbon. She hesitated. It is a profound instinctual human reaction. The hesitation of hands hovering over an object that the subconscious already knows will irrevocably alter reality. Garrett's jaw tightened. I catalogued the expression immediately. It was the exact micro-expression I had observed in countless depositions, when a hostile witness realizes they have been outflanked, but hasn't yet formulated a defense. He didn't know what was in the folder, but he knew my profession, and he knew he should be terrified of it. Open it, Chloe, I instructed, my tone mild but carrying the weight of an absolute directive. It was the tone I used when advising a board of directors that they had no options left. Chloe's trembling fingers caught the edge of the silk ribbon. She pulled, the red ribbon fell away, pooling softly on the table. She flipped the heavy manila cover open. The first page was the certified copy of the divorce petition from upstate New York. Garrett Mercer v. Chloe Mercer filed on October 15th. I watched the color drain from my sister's face. It didn't happen slowly, it happened all at once. As if someone had pulled a plug and the life force had simply rushed out of her. She read the date, she read the plaintiff's name, she read the grounds for dissolution. Irreconcilable differences. Her hands began to shake violently. She turned to the second page. It was the asset schedule attached to the divorce filing, heavily annotated by me in bright fluorescent yellow highlighter. She read the list of their supposedly joint accounts, noting the balances that had been systematically zeroed out. She turned another page. She saw the documentation regarding her secondary trust fund. The trust Garrett had convinced her to grant him proxy access to, showing a complete liquidation. She turned another page, the beneficiary change on the massive life insurance policy, shifting the payout from her to a Delaware LLC controlled exclusively by her husband. She turned one more page, the international wire transfer receipts, the staggered, methodical movement of $2.5 million from domestic accounts into a numbered corporate account in Georgetown, Cayman Islands. She read the first 3 pages in absolute silence. The only sound in the room was the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. I knew exactly how long it takes for a human brain to process catastrophic betrayal. It takes about 30 seconds for the denial to shatter and the horrific reality to flood in. What is this?" Chloe whispered, her voice cracked. She didn't look at me, she looked slowly, agonizingly to her right, staring at the man she had married. The man she had just blindly obeyed in an effort to exile her own sister. Garrett's composure, the flawless armor he had worn for 5 years, finally cracked. The charismatic wealth manager vanished, replaced by a cornered predator. "Chloe, don't look at that. It's a manipulation, it's out of context," he stammered, his voice rising in panic. "Out of context?" Chloe repeated, her voice suddenly spiking into a hysterical register. She slammed the divorce petition down onto the table. The crystal wine glasses rattled. You filed for divorce 2 months ago. You filed for divorce in upstate New York so I wouldn't see the summons. She grabbed the wire transfer receipts and shoved them toward him. $2.5 million. You moved $2.5 million to the Cayman Islands. My trust fund, our equity line. What is this, Garrett? Garrett immediately pivoted to his only available defense mechanism. In crisis PR we call it DARVO, deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. He turned his panic toward me, his eyes blazing with genuine hatred. Your sister manufactured this. Garrett shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at me across the table. She is a professional manipulator. She works in crisis management, Chloe. She fakes documents for a living to protect billionaires. She hacked my accounts, she fabricated these wire transfers, and she forged a divorce filing just to destroy our marriage, because she's a miserable, lonely woman who can't stand to see you happy. I didn't raise my voice, I simply picked up my wine glass, took a sip, and looked at him with an expression of profound pity. The divorce petition is a certified public record, Garrett, I said calmly. It has the municipal seal of the county court, stamped in the upper right-hand corner. Anyone in this room can verify its authenticity on the state judicial portal right now. And as for the wire transfers, I didn't fabricate them. I merely asked an international banking contact to pull the SWIFT routing numbers you so sloppily authorized from your IP address. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table. You voted me out of the family, Chloe. But he filed the paperwork to vote you out of your marriage 2 months ago. You were a host organism, and he has successfully drained you. My father, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally found his voice. Garrett, is this true? Did you move Chloe's money offshore? Richard, it's an investment strategy. Garrett lied, his voice desperate, the sweat visibly beading on his forehead. It's a tax-sheltered vehicle in the Caymans. I was going to surprise Chloe with it for our anniversary. Sloan is twisting standard wealth management procedures into a conspiracy. Julian, my perpetually immature younger brother, slowly reached across the table. He didn't look at Garrett. He picked up the final piece of paper in the manila folder, the document Chloe hadn't reached yet. It was the confirmed passenger manifest from my airline contact. Julian read it, his hands were shaking just as badly as Chloe's. He looked up, his eyes wide and horrified, staring at the man who had promised him venture capital, funding, and a new life. If it's an investment strategy, Garrett, Julian said, his voice barely a whisper, then why do you have a one-way, first-class ticket booked to Georgetown, departing the day after tomorrow? You're not investing her money. You're fleeing with it. The room went entirely silent. The final inescapable piece of evidence had been laid bare. Julian dropped the itinerary onto the table as if it were radioactive. He looked at me, the sister he had actively conspired against just 20 minutes prior. His eyes were wet, his jaw was working furiously, struggling to process the magnitude of his own gullibility. You knew, Julian said, his voice breaking. You knew he was going to run, and he told me that if we just got you to sign over the estate tonight, he would have the liquidity to fund my startup. He was going to use the deed to the manor to take out a massive bridge loan, I explained quietly, addressing Julian but watching Garrett. He was going to add the equity of our family estate to his offshore account, and then he was going to board that flight on December 26th. He wasn't going to fund your startup, Julian. He was going to leave you, and our parents, completely bankrupt and legally responsible for the fallout. My mother, Eleanor, let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She pressed her hand to her mouth, staring at Garrett with an expression of absolute revulsion. The aristocratic vanity she had worn like armor for decades had completely dissolved. She was looking at the man she had favored over her own daughter, realizing he was nothing more than a high-end grifter. Chloe was hyperventilating. She clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her silver dress glittering mockingly in the candlelight. She looked at the divorce petition. She looked at the offshore transfer receipts. She looked at the flight itinerary. Garrett looked around the room, He looked at the horrified faces of the family he had spent 5 years meticulously cultivating and dismantling. He looked at the exits. The charming sociopath realized with terrifying clarity that he was entirely out of moves. The board had been flipped. "I'm leaving," Garrett announced abruptly. He threw his linen napkin onto the table. He didn't look at Chloe. He didn't offer an apology or another fabricated excuse. He simply abandoned the performance entirely. He turned toward the foyer, his footsteps heavy and fast against the hardwood floor. "I wouldn't advise going to the airport, Garrett," I called out after him, my voice ringing clearly through the silent dining room. He stopped in the doorway, his back rigid. He slowly turned his head to look at me, pure venom in his eyes. "Why not?" he spat. I offered him a small, perfectly polite smile, "Because while you were busy organizing a family vote to steal my house, I was busy forwarding your offshore wire transfer routing numbers to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. You moved $2.5 million across international borders while actively filing a fraudulent asset disclosure in a domestic family court. That isn't just a messy divorce, Garrett, that's federal money laundering." I picked up my wine glass and took another slow sip. The FBI doesn't usually bother with family drama, but they are incredibly interested in wire fraud. I imagine they'll be waiting for you at the departure gate. Garrett didn't say another word. He didn't attempt to salvage the situation or offer a final, charismatic lie. He simply bolted. We heard the heavy front door open and slam shut, the sound echoing through the expansive foyer. A few seconds later, the roar of the Mercedes engine cutting through the quiet, snow-covered night signaled his frantic, inevitable departure. He was a man running from a federal indictment, leaving behind the wreckage of the family he had so meticulously dismantled. The silence that descended upon the dining room after his exit was entirely different from the silence that had preceded the vote. The earlier silence had been pregnant with anticipation and malicious intent. This new silence was the suffocating, heavy quiet of absolute devastation. Chloe collapsed into her chair. She didn't weep gracefully. She sobbed with deep, ragged gasps, her hands covering her face, the glittering silver dress contrasting grotesquely with the utter ruin of her reality. She was mourning the loss of a husband who had never truly existed, a man who had viewed her affection as nothing more than a highly lucrative asset to be liquidated. Julian remained frozen in his seat, staring blankly at the flight itinerary still resting on the table. The illusion of his impending success, the venture capital funding Garrett had dangled like a carrot, had evaporated, leaving him to face the stark reality of his own failures and his profound susceptibility to manipulation. My parents, the socialites who had spent their entire lives prioritizing appearances over authenticity, looked fundamentally broken. My mother, Eleanor, reached out a trembling hand toward Chloe, but she didn't touch her. She seemed paralyzed, unable to offer comfort, because doing so would require acknowledging her own complicity. She had championed Garrett. She had allowed him to poison her against me. She had actively participated in the plot to exile me from my own home, all for the sake of an estate she felt she was owed. "Sloan," Julian finally spoke, his voice thick with unshed tears. He looked up at me, his expression pleading. "Sloan, I'm so sorry. I didn't know he was doing this. He told me it was just a reorganization. He said you were holding the family back, I swear. I didn't know he was stealing from Chloe." I looked at my younger brother. I felt a fleeting pang of pity, but I immediately compartmentalized it. Pity is a useless emotion in the aftermath of a crisis. It only serves to blur the lines of accountability. "You didn't know he was stealing, Julian," I agreed, my voice remaining completely steady and clinical. "But you knew you were voting to exile me. You knew you were conspiring to force me out of the home grandfather left me, simply because Garrett promised you a shortcut to wealth. Ignorance of his ultimate crime does not absolve you of your participation in the conspiracy." Julian flinched as if I had struck him. He looked back down at the table, his shoulders slumped in defeat. My father, Richard, cleared his throat. He tried to muster the authoritative tone he had relied upon for decades, but it sounded hollow. "Sloan, please, this is a catastrophe. We made a terrible error in judgment. We trusted the wrong man. But we are still your family. We need to figure out how to navigate this. Chloe is going to need a massive legal defense to recover those offshore funds. I stood up slowly. The emerald silk of my dress rustled softly against the antique dining chairs. I picked up my wine glass, finished the last sip of the vintage Bordeaux, and set the crystal carefully back onto the table. I looked at my father, and then I looked at the rest of them. The people who had eagerly anticipated my destruction. You are correct about one thing, Richard, I said, dropping the familial title entirely. This is a catastrophe, and Chloe will undoubtedly need a team of incredibly aggressive international asset recovery attorneys to have even a fraction of a percent chance of repatriating those funds from the Cayman Islands before Garrett's shell companies disperse them entirely. I paused, letting my gaze sweep over the luxurious, perfectly appointed dining room. But that is not my crisis to manage. Chloe finally looked up from her hands, her face streaked with mascara, her eyes wide with desperate disbelief. Sloan, you can't mean that. You're a crisis manager. You know how to handle things like this. You have contacts. You just said you know people at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. You have to help me. I have nothing left. He took everything. He took everything because you gave him the keys. Chloe, I replied, my voice devoid of any sisterly warmth. It was the voice of a consultant terminating a severely toxic client relationship. You gave him proxy access to your trusts. You signed the documents that allowed him to drain the equity line. You chose to believe his lies because they were comfortable, and you chose to attack me because I represented the uncomfortable truth. I walked around the table, retrieving the thick manila folder and the scattered documents. I stacked the divorce petition, the wire transfers, and the flight manifest neatly. I placed them back into the folder, but I didn't tie the red ribbon. I didn't need to wrap the truth in a pretty package anymore. When you arrived here tonight, I said, standing near the head of the table, where Chloe had delivered her rehearsed verdict just 30 minutes ago, you informed me that I was no longer a part of this family. You told me that my behavior made me detached, and that I treated you like clients instead of relatives. I looked directly at my sister, my expression as cold and unforgiving as the winter storm raging outside the manor windows. You were wrong, I told her. I fight fiercely for my clients, I protect my clients from predators, I shield them from public ruin, and I dedicate every ounce of my professional expertise to ensuring their survival. I didn't treat you like clients, I treated you like the hostile liabilities you actively chose to become. I placed the manila folder on the table directly in front of her. You wanted me out of the family, Chloe. You voted for it. I am simply honoring the result of your democratic process. I turned my back on them. I walked out of the formal dining room, my stiletto heels echoing sharply against the hardwood floor. I didn't look back to see my mother weeping or my brother burying his face in his hands. I retrieved my cashmere coat from the foyer, slipped it over the emerald silk dress, and opened the heavy front doors. The cold night air hit me immediately, sharp and bracing. It felt like absolute clarity. I walked down the snow-covered steps of my estate, leaving them behind in the wreckage of the dinner they had orchestrated. They were trapped in a house they had tried to steal, mourning a wealth they had willingly handed to a thief. I got into my reliable 5-year-old sedan, started the engine, and drove down the sweeping driveway toward the main road. I later learned the details of Garrett's departure through the same professional channels I had used to expose him. He didn't make it to the Cayman Islands. My tip to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, combined with the staggering volume of the unauthorized offshore transfers, triggered an immediate federal flag. Garrett was apprehended at JFK International Airport on Christmas Day, attempting to board a connecting flight to the Caribbean with a forged secondary passport. He was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and money laundering. His exit strategy had been flawless, except for the single variable he had fatally underestimated. He had assumed I would react like a wounded sister, instead of a forensic professional. As for Chloe and my parents, the ensuing months were a grueling, humiliating public spectacle. The divorce proceedings, now heavily scrutinized by federal investigators, became a matter of public record. The details of Garrett's embezzlement were splashed across financial blogs and local gossip columns. My parents, desperate to avoid the social stigma of bankruptcy, were forced to aggressively downsize, selling off their Manhattan penthouse and retreating into obscurity to fund Chloe's astronomical legal fees. They attempted to contact me several times. My mother left tearful voicemails pleading for forgiveness. Julian sent lengthy, agonizing emails detailing his newfound commitment to therapy and personal responsibility. Chloe texted me, begging for a loan to cover her retaining fees, promising she had learned her lesson. I never responded. I instructed my attorneys to send a formal cease and desist letter to all of them, legally barring any further contact. Forgiveness is a gift, and I do not give gifts to people who organize a firing squad and then expect me to supply the ammunition. My life now is exceptionally peaceful. I continue to manage corporate crises, navigating the treacherous waters of high-stakes PR with the same clinical precision I have always possessed. I still live in the Hudson Valley Manor, the estate my grandfather wisely recognized required a guardian who understood the value of preservation over exploitation. If you are watching this and you are the family scapegoat, the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who is constantly told that your boundaries are cold and your standards are unreasonable, I want you to listen carefully. Do not let them weaponize the concept of family against you. The people who truly love you will never ask you to compromise your security, your ethics, or your sanity to accommodate their delusions. And when a group of people collectively decides to vote you out of your own life, do not fight to stay in a room where you are not respected. Gather your facts, maintain your composure, let them perform their theatrical outrage, and when the moment is perfectly aligned, slide the truth across the table. And then walk away. You do not need to stay and manage the ruins of a house you didn't burn down. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share this story if you believe that the most powerful response to betrayal is absolute, unbothered success. I will see you all in the next video. Remember, the quietest person in the room is rarely the weakest. They are simply waiting for the right time to speak.